Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this one, we start out in the direction of Nevelske to the north of Kleshchiivka, where the Russians have advanced along the forest lines east of the village. This is combined with the Russian foothold within the southeastern parts of Nevelske, an attempt by the Russians to gain control over the rest of the village. With the consolidated gains here in the east of Neleipivka, following the Russian captured fortified positions, the Russians are now able to attack Neleipivka from the north, east, and south at the same time. This will allow the Russians to gain control over Neleipivka through a simultaneous attack from multiple directions and push the Ukrainians out of the village. This time around, the Russians do not have a massive gap in their rear where the Ukrainians can hit them from. This means that the Ukrainians will be forced to withdraw to the northwest to the next line of defense of fortified positions east of Nevelske, and it will be difficult for the Ukrainians to hold on to Nevelske now that the Russians have secured their flank. South in the direction of Krasnoyarivka, the Russians have consolidated and pushed the Ukrainians out of the central parts of Krasnoyarivka, fully gaining control over the eastern parts through this assault to the north of the city, and with this the Russians now have a significantly improved position within Krasnoyarivka, and the Ukrainians have been pushed to the outskirts of the city. The further from the center of the city you get, the more difficult it is to defend your positions. Therefore, the Ukrainians' positions here in the northwestern outskirts of Krasnoyarivka are less defensible than what the positions in the center and in the east had been prior to the Russian advances. Now that the Russians have advanced so far behind Ukrainian lines, they are now in position where the Ukrainians are forced to withdraw towards the outskirts of the city and are losing control over the main part of it. The main part of Krasnoyarivka, the part of the city that isn't on the outskirts here outside of the city itself, are now almost completely under Russian control. Following this, the Russians will likely launch attacks from the east and from the south towards the final pass of the Ukrainian positions in Krasnoyarivka, as it is separated from any other positions of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have numerous fortified positions in the open fields north and west of Krasnoyarivka. However, there is no significant base or outpost of the Ukrainians that they can operate from in the direction of Krasnoyarivka. Therefore, with the current situation in Krasnoyarivka, it is only a matter of time before the Russians gain full control of it, and this will allow the Russians to start operations here to the west of Ryorivka in the direction of Maximilianivka and Kurakhove, and in the northern direction northwest of Nevelske towards the Ukrainian line of defense going from Karelivka to Kurakhove. The front line between Nevelske and Krasnoyarivka is well connected, as it is the same direction of offensive operations that the Russians are fighting in from Karelivka and down south to Kurakhove. The current situation is that the Russians are attacking the Ukrainian fortified positions across the entirety of this section of the front line, and they are looking to gain control over these frontline positions, which will lead to a much better position for the Russians, and a control over Krasnoyarivka and Nevelske here in the center will allow the Russians to use both of those, as well as Ryorivka and Neleipivka, as a springboard for the next offensive, which goes to Kurakhove, Karelivka, and everything in between. Further north here in the direction of Progress and Losovetsk, the Russians have managed to capture the area in between the two villages of Ukrainian fortified positions, both along the road and to the east of it, moving through from the Progress direction and the Losovetsk direction to connect the two flanks and cut off the Ukrainians in the area, allowed them to quickly gain control over the fortified positions. The next target of the Russians is the one right next to it. Gaining control over that as well will allow the Russians to start pushing towards Ivanivka to the west, Vovchansk to the south, and Timofivka to the north, where the focus will be the fortified positions of these three areas. Gaining control over those will allow the Russians to gain control over the subsequent villages connected to these fortified positions, and the battle over Vyshneve will begin. The current situation around Vyshneve is that it is at a very important choke point. Therefore, the Ukrainians have put a lot of effort and time and units into protecting it. A large concentration of Ukrainian forces are located in this direction, and there are two defensible positions of the Ukrainians in the area. First off, there is this river line connected to this height position here just southwest of Vyshneve. Taking a look at the topographic map, we can see that the area just southwest of Vyshneve is a high ground that is towering at a peak of 224 meters. Compared to the Russian positions to the southeast by Ocheretine, it is slightly less elevation, but going forward ahead of Vyshneve, we see at the intersection itself is already at a 15-meter lower elevation. And if we take a look at the entire area outside of this area here, which is the peak of the heights in the area, we can see that the other positions of the Ukrainians are all somewhere around 15 to 30 meters less of an elevation than that at Vyshneve. This means that this is the highest ground that the Ukrainians still hold on to by the highway between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. The loss of that position will lead to the Ukrainians having a lower elevation than the Russians and thereby a much harder time defending against the Russian offensive in the area. Therefore, the Ukrainians are using Vyshneve as a choke point between the two river lines to stop the Russian advance right here. Otherwise, they will likely lose the entire area ahead of the intersection, and thereby the Russians will be allowed to cut off the main highway between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. Therefore, we can see that one of the main battles here west of Avdiivka will take place right here at Vyshneve, as the Russians will attempt to break through the Ukrainian choke point and launch an attack towards the intersection, as the proximity between the Russian positions at the outskirts of Vyshneve to the highway is just short of 6 kilometers, and this distance is a very small distance in this war. We know that it has taken the Russians a long time to advance vast distances, but since February the Russians have advanced from the outskirts of Avdiivka and all the way to Vyshneve, which is 27 kilometers. That means an average of 5 kilometers a month since February, and this would mean that within the month the Russians would gain control over the intersection and thereby create their own choke point between that of Pokrovsk in the southwest and Konstantinivka in the northeast. So we see a main battle is going to be taking place by Vyshneve, and there's already heavy artillery fire between the two sides over it. At the same time, we see here in the direction of Toretsk this video footage here. The footage shows heavy smoke and fires all across Toretsk as heavy bombardment of the city takes place due to the fighting that is taking place on the eastern outskirts of it. The Russians are heavily bombarding all of the Ukrainian positions both at the front line and within the city. At the same time, the Ukrainians are also launching artillery strikes and FPV drones on Russian positions on the outskirts. Therefore, we see very heavy fighting and big fires all across the front line in the city of Toretsk as heavy fighting continues. It is approximately 40 to 50,000 soldiers of both sides together combined that are fighting over this city. It is comparable to the early days of the Battle of Bakhmut. We see a significant amount of soldiers are fighting over the frontline positions all across the front now that both the Russians and the Ukrainians have a lot of troops at the front line. And this is why we see such massive battles, and now rather than just a few buildings being occupied by a few soldiers, we now see more buildings being occupied by more soldiers. Therefore, the rate of casualties from these bombardments also increase as the fighting escalates. Moving further north here in the direction of Vyshneve, the Russians have captured the final parts of the town. They've also managed to move up north and capture parts of the heights as the battle now goes on to the Ukrainian fortified positions north of the town. It was also reported by the Russian Ministry of Defense that they captured Vyshneve and Neleipivka here to the south. So with this, we see that the Russian offensive operations continue here in the Luhansk-Kharkiv section of the borderline. And as well, we see a new development in the Vovchansk direction, where the Russians have captured yet another apartment complex building here in the citadel area within the central parts of Vovchansk. Now, we may be questioning why would you report even if it's such a small advance. That is because the current situation is that the citadel area is really the only part of the Vovchansk direction that is still standing in the residential area. This means that the Ukrainians, if they lose the citadel area, will be forced to withdraw to the eastern parts of the town or down to the southern parts of the town. This means the Russians would gain control over this area right here if the Russians capture the citadel area. This means that although the advance is small within the citadel area, it is much larger. If we zoom enough in, we can see that it covers half of the screen. So if you just put it into perspective, any small advance can be considered big, and any big advance can be considered small in the grand scale of things.